On June 13th, 2016, the world of tokusatsu would receive a new player in Kamen Rider Ex-Aid, the newly leaked trademark for the upcoming season of Kamen Rider. Without any other information, the main speculation at the moment for the season's motif revolved around the aid part of the name, theoretically pointing to a rescue or health services themed show that provided aid. These theories were fueled by some rumors that surfaced which stated the belt would be called the Ex-Aid Driver and worked with gimmicks called the X-Viruses. They created forms called Shapes, with Kamen Rider X-Fighter joining X-Aid's fights. Things took a drastic turn pretty quickly, as in a unique twist, the title would not be the only trademark that was filed. The Gamer Driver, Rider Gashaton, and Gashikon Breaker names, these names had nothing to do with the rescue theme implied by the original title, as there was a clear video game motif at play with the gear. Needless to say, there was a great deal of confusion among the Rider fandom since these trademarks were so at odds with each other, but somehow were all true. A new rumor played off of the new trademarks and said that the rescue name was due to the main character being a physician, while the design of the suit was similar to a fighting game character with big goggles, pupils, and spiky hair, all done in pink and green. Unlike the prior rumor, this one was confirmed in July with the first ever look at Kamen Rider Ex-Aid in the form of a leak for the vinyl figure of his unnamed base form. Just like the trademarks, this blew apart the Rider fandom, but in a different way, because many hated this initial design for its bright colors, cartoon pupil departure from the bug eyes, and the hair. The first look at the proper suit on a leaked poster didn't help those people calm down, as it revealed the eyes and hair would be a motif for the other riders of the show, the bike, and this chunky little friend. The names of these new additions and more were revealed by the legendary leaks of Ex-Aid's Q1 toy catalog. We got our first up-close look at the Gamer Driver and Gashikon Breaker from before, in addition to new Gashikon weapons and a bunch of the Rider Gashitons mentioned earlier. Most notably, a drastically different looking Dragonite Hunter Zet. Ex-Aid's chunky form was confirmed to be a level 1 variation of the character, with his base form being level 2 and the first upgrade being level 3, with an unknown level coming after that. Kamen Rider Brave and Snipe were the names of the other riders and followed a similar leveling scheme with their own unique gashets, and the bike was apparently its own Kamen Rider called Lazer with an S? Racer, yeah, he's a bike. Kamen Rider Racer, duh. Kamen Rider Genm with a U was also seen for the first time with a different level 3 visor, and like other riders, he had a tease for a new form accessed by his Gashikon bug visor. An HD version of the previous poster came with a synopsis for the season, which spoke of M, spelled E-M, a computer genius and gamer that created the Gamer Driver and Rider Gashitons to defeat the bugsters invading our world as Kamen Rider Ex-Aid. Okay, well, that's not entirely accurate, as we know, but at the time, it was all we knew of Ex-Aid's story for a bit, because for a while, all we got was some eye candy. Literally. TV Asahi released an image of Ex-Aid's unique eyes as the start of a month-long tease to the little level 1 as the new Kamen Rider. This coincided with Kamen Rider Ex-Aid's first ever on-screen appearance at a talk show where he... oh dear. And he can't level up. Oh. Well, that's alright. Before this, both forms would appear in that month's magazines to tease a cameo in Kamen Rider Ghost's upcoming movie. The movie's release in the beginning of August provided the first taste of the season, featuring slightly different video game music and effects, but also the Mighty Action X transformation sound and Emu in a voice role. It also confirmed that the gimmicks were called Rider Gashats, not Gashitons. Usually, we have to wait until a press conference to get more details, but another another round of magazines took the charge this time around and showed off the entire main cast, like literally everyone. Graphite is even there, not in human form. But it also, speaking of Graphite, gave us our first looks at the Bugsters, and most prominently, Emu, Hiro, and Taiga. The lack of Racer led many to believe that he was some sort of robot or game character that was given life by the gamer driver and became Ex-Aid's rider machine. But at the press conference, we got a bunch of new information. We got to meet the main cast and the singer for Excite, and the first trailer of the show got released. It focused on Emu and teased the other riders that would appear, but kept the identity of Kamen Rider Lazer and Genmu without a U a secret. Lazer's identity would be revealed to not be a robot in magazine scans the following month, while Genmu would set records. He became the first non-primary rider to cameo at the end of a season, showing off the Shakarigi Sports Gasha to coincide with its release in the toy line. In the subsequent special chapter episode, the star himself arrived in Kamen Rider Ghost and left behind a gift for his predecessor, as it was time for the game of Kamen Rider Ex-Aid to begin. So that was a bit of a trip down memory lane. For those who don't know, Kamen Rider Ex-Aid was essentially my first season of the franchise. I got into it thanks to Drive, but this was the first time I saw the leaks for any tokusatsu before it actually aired. I vividly remember staring at those first catalog scans for hours, just completely mesmerized by these wacky video game designs. When episode 1 aired, an upload of the first fight scene just stayed with me. I really couldn't stop thinking about it. This would lead to Ex-Aid becoming the first Rider season I watched weekly and completed as it was airing, meaning it'll always have a special place in my heart. If you've watched my videos for any amount of time, you probably know that this is my favorite season of Kamen Rider. I mean, look at me. Flash forward to 5 years later after the show was finished airing, I've watched many more seasons of Kamen Rider and other tokusatsu, and I finally got around to rewatching Ex-Aid in its entirety, but the magic of that first season still hasn't worn off to me, and spoilers, it's definitely still my favorite for Kamen Rider and all of tokusatsu. Honestly, I don't really even see a point in doing this video. Like, we already know the end result is just going to be me talking about why I like this show. We already know where it places on my big season ranking. Look, here's the list. Look, there it is at the top. I actually even have a review for the show out already right after it ended, so might as well end this here. Wait, what's happening? How did I get here? I don't have the belt anymore. Oh, it's back here. And it's gold now. And I must be going crazy. What are you talking about? What's happened? Well, to be fair, I was kind of shy about my voice at the time, and it's fine, the video doesn't even pop up in YouTube recommended, which is maybe more of a reason to redo it. I'm not sure how that'll... Okay, I have an idea, but do we know if it'll work? It'll work. Let's review Kamen Rider Ex-Aid. Kanjo no unme wa Orage Karu Henshin! Dai Henshin! No, continue there. Kuyashi Teze! X8's first arc is such a perfect start to this season. The introduction is awesome. Of course, there's the iconic scene that just looks amazing even without the later context, but then there's also Emu's really grounded introduction that perfectly sets up his mission to become a doctor and how it connects to his love for games, and also how that just connects to the show's overall themes. It also just perfectly sets up the later episodes and even the rest of the season. For starters, the introductions of the main cast. I think it's awesome that when a writer is introduced here, the episode focuses completely on them so that we not only have a good idea of their personality, but also how they interact with the other characters. By the end of Hiro's introduction, he's set up as this pretty clear mirror to Emu, but the show doesn't really pick a side with their ideals. Emu's dedication to the patient is just as useful as Hiro's lack of emotion, making Hiro still feel pretty important. Taiga is portrayed as a darker version of the M personality by being obsessed with the gashats instead of like normal games, so naturally he's at odds with Emu, but it also creates this interesting relationship with Hiro because Hiro is essentially an extreme version of X8's doctor normal personality. So this main trio is set up to interlock with each other in these different ways, which sets up how Kirya and Genmu throw a wrench into things. I really enjoyed how Kirya's introduced as Emu's one true ally. He is the writer machine after all, but the idea is subverted at the end of his episode when he's revealed to be a liar going after the bugsters, which happens to put him in direct conflict with Genmu. Literally, because the first level 3 form is introduced to jumpstart the coming power struggle in that episode. I like that afterwards episode 5 is sort of structured like a Genmu focused episode to mimic the prior episodes focusing on those writers, except there's the twist that the person we've been focusing on the whole episode isn't really Genmu, it's Graphite. Then Kuroto's reveal at the end of the episode brings us full circle to actually being a Genmu introduction episode and sets the stage for the Kuroto and Kirya rivalry that runs parallel to the main trio. With such an amazing foundation set in just the first few episodes, the rest of the arc builds on it beautifully. Emu's ideals as a doctor get tested with the Genmu episode, but they triumph once he becomes the first hero to acquire level 3. Hiro gets a wonderful amount of depth to his character with the reveal of his gut-wrenching backstory, and it helps reveal why Taiga is so obsessed with the gashats since we don't really delve into his own backstory. And then there's the tragedy of Kirya. He's probably my favorite character in this first arc, obviously because he's super charismatic and his base form is a bike and he wears a really cool jacket, but I really just enjoyed his focus episode. It's structured again almost like a tragedy, beginning with him starting to become a better ally, telling the truth and talking about his past, before it all comes crashing down at the end of the episode and he's left with nothing but his rivalry with Kuroto. Speaking of Kuroto, I think this first arc is peak Kuroto as Kamen Rider Genmu. I already mentioned how much I love the misdirect and double reveal, and the voice modulator of Genmu just adds to it.
お前が相手をするのはまだ早い。死のデータを取れ。
But the mystery of his ultimate plan is also so much fun to watch unfold because there are so many pieces that are put into play because of him, like the giving out gamer drivers randomly, faking the theft of the level 3 gashats, and you kind of just want to see why he did all of that and how it like fits together. And then in hindsight, it works really well because you know it's just him collecting battle data, so he's orchestrating every event just to see how his technology performs in real world situations. Because as we know, he does have some of his own technology that he has used in the field in the Ghost episodes, but you would assume he's like using it to the extent he knows it can go, but by giving it to other people, they don't know the extent, so they kind of give him like all the data he can get because it's like a real world situation, and I just think it's really awesome. It also helps that Kuroto's actor plays the part really well. He just sounds really cunning when like he switches, and there's even early hints of his insanity, which obviously ascends to a completely different level later on. Parrot just says as a funny every so often, so the only other notable villain for now is Graphite. He's somewhat generic, but by making him spread the Bugster virus, he's more active as a boss compared to Genmu, which is a great setup to him signifying the strength of all 4 players when they work together, even if it's temporary. Part of what makes all of this work so well is the doctor aspect. The classic victims of the week feel important because they all become patients that our doctors are trying to take care of, fitting perfectly into that motif. But they also tie into the characters expertly. In Hero's episode, the patient is involved with a romance to foreshadow and then mirror his relationship with Saki. Taiga doesn't focus on the patients in his episodes, allowing Emu to step in and show the contrast between those characters. Part of what makes Graphite's reveal so impactful is that he's initially presented as that week's Bugster patient, but then he subverts the whole thing by becoming a Bugster himself. And then Kyria's episodes have patients that are reflections of him, with the second one kind of providing an explanation for why he lies, which adds onto the tragedy of the character until we eventually end with his infamous death. The big fight is foreshadowed as early as episode 3 when Hero mentions the game over. It adds more to the tragedy because the characters were finally accepting Kiria. Hero, of all people, acknowledges Kuroto as Genmu wasn't a lie, but still Kiria suffers the ultimate consequence. He may have been a liar, but he still suffered at the hands of the Bugsters in a bit of a different way, which made him just that much more intriguing that he has this vendetta against them. Combined with the lack of a normal opening, there's this ominous feeling to how episode 12 of X8 completely changes the status quo of the season, even before the first major death. Thanks to a Mighty Brothers cameo, the evolution of the Bugster virus, the reveal of Kamen Rider Chronicle, the arrival of Nico and Masamune Dan, and Kuroto's firm establishment as our terrifying main villain, capable of the ultimate sin just for personal gain, Kamen Rider X8 established itself as a force to be reckoned with. And not just because, oh my god, they killed the main character, this show is so dark, Christmas will never be the same in Kamen Rider, but with the entirety of this first arc, how every episode develops the plot and merges the characters in different ways to create a satisfying, overarching story, but introduces new developments alongside open-ended events to set up a continuation. Everything in X8 just builds on top of each other so well, almost like the ideas level up. One complaint I do have is this repeated mention of the characters needing to clear the main 10 Gashat games, which never leads to anything actually happening. Even Kuroto acknowledges that the 10 Gashats have been gathered, what will you do? But the 10 Gashats existing together doesn't really end up doing anything, which is a bit annoying, but it's fine. The 10 Gashats do play a huge role in the one last thing I love about this first arc that's present in the rest of the show, which is the world building. World building is one of my favorite elements of storytelling. I really love the implication that there's so much else going on in this world that we're not always a part of, and X8 perfectly captures that feeling with the toys it's trying to sell you, so it doesn't really feel like toys it's trying to sell you. The biggest instance of this is in episode 1 with a whole release event for Mighty Action X that even includes people playing the game that you can actually go and buy. And then of course Mighty Action X as a game is the basis of the design for our main character. It's even like where his powers come from. This continues as a motif throughout the rest of the show. Every time a new Gashat gets introduced, we get a little look at their title screen sometimes, and one of the characters gives a little spiel about what the game is about and how it's played. And this even happens for some of the Gashats in the side content, which really ties every aspect of the season together. And it's really helpful in the first episodes when we meet a character, because it's kind of like, oh, there's like stuff to the game this character is using, which kind of implies like, you know, there's stuff to this character as well. With every rider, form, and upgrade getting this attachment to a whole separate event within the universe of X8, it makes this world feel so alive, and I love it to death. It's also present in the rest of the aesthetics of the season, which makes everything so much cooler, but I'll talk about that later, because now it's time to move on to X8's second arc. Henshin! Ah, this is over. God damn it. Henshin! Henshin! So while the first arc did a great job at setting up a foundation for the show, the second arc did just as good a job of expanding on it and creating this big, complete storyline. One important factor that contributes to this is Kirya. And yes, I know that he's dead. Another piece of setup from the previous arc was the whole mystery behind Emu's compatibility surgery, something that I kind of forgot in my original viewing of the show. The reason for this is because in the first arc, it kind of is more of this background plot, but what makes it more interesting in retrospect is how this investigation was headed by Kirya and is what gets him killed. That functions as this inciting incident that gets the other characters involved and then makes the second arc much more unified in terms of an overall story, and I have to commend it for that. A huge one-up over the prior arc is the villains. I know I said Kuroto from earlier was like peak Kuroto, but Kamen Rider Genmu level 10 is kind of what my first thought is when I think of, well, Kamen Rider Genmu, especially with him wielding the Gashikon Sparrow that he pried off of Kirya's dead body. I mean, this is really just Kuroto from the first arc again, but since now he doesn't have to operate in the shadows, we get to see his cunning nature on full display, and he's just scarier. The immortality component contributed greatly to this, but I also kind of like how it contributes to the insane Kuroto. There's really a slow descent here, where he's first cheated death, then he creates all these crazy new Gashats, and then acquires level X, to the point where, you know, it kind of makes sense he sees himself as this game master controlling everything, and then he turns into a crazy laughing maniac because the heroes can't stop him. I also really like how they make him this intelligent character, like the part where he gave himself the Bugster virus in order to evade the Ministry of Health. I really liked this somewhat restrained but still insane version of Kuroto. My only complaint is that level X feels really lackluster. He makes a big deal of it, like, oh, I've got level X, but I never really got the vibe he was so much more powerful to where it's literally called a whole different level. But I'm also not sure what else could have been done to make him more powerful, because I kind of like there's no new toy. Maybe they could have had him dual wield Gashikon bug visors while wearing the Buggle driver, or there's this thing with like a duplicate Genmu, so maybe Kuroto could create like a bootleg Mighty Brothers, and when he transforms he splits into two Genmus with like the game master personality and his like normal personality. This honestly bothers me more than like the reveal that he infected Emu 16 years ago. Over the years, I've seen a lot of people have a lot of negative thoughts on that plot point, anywhere from like the insane pettiness he has to send a virus to someone because that person sent some game OCs, or the level of foresight required to try and cultivate this virus to create an ultimate game, or the fact the bugsters come from Y2K. And I'm just gonna be honest, it doesn't really bother me that much. Kuroto is obviously evil, and he's been planning development with the bugsters since their inception, so it is pretty weird, but whatever. The Y2K thing is honestly pretty funny though, and I think more people just need to embrace the insanity of Y2K incorporating itself into a Kamen Rider show. And I think it was super interesting to see how his plan sorta inverts itself as the new data he's collecting comes straight from the bugsters, and he starts to take back all the Gashats he's distributed with the intention of getting new Kamen Rider players, I think, for Kamen Rider Chronicle. But some really cool situations came out of it too. Like, there's this really fun bit of lore where as long as a rider is in possession of a Gashat that's attached to a Gashikon weapon, they can use that weapon. So there's this moment where Genmu's wielding the Sparrow, and then you can see the sword and the Magnum around him, and that moment's always stuck with me. I thought it looked really cool. Then we get to see Kuroto actually do some actual programming as well when he creates both Gashat gear duels, and it's just a really cool thing to see a main villain do. And the code is actually somewhat accurate. Like, it actually looks like real code for a game, and I think that's just a really great detail of the show that makes me appreciate it more. Speaking of Gashat gear duels in general, a notable part of this arc is Parrot. I liked that before he joined the fight properly, his character joins the main character interactions by beginning his rivalry with Emu. Parrot just wants to play games, worlds where you can continue after death, juxtaposed with Emu, who has just dealt with real death as a doctor. Not only is this a really intriguing start to the arc after Kirya's death and a foreshadowing for the end of the arc, but it's also a great demonstration for why the Doctor and video game motifs manage to work beautifully together in the show. This makes Kamen Rider Paradox a really fun antagonist because he's just here to cause havoc, and it's just really fun to see in action. One of my favorite tidbits is how he mentions that Burger Action Gamer is level 4 before Emu even uses the Gashat, implying that bugsters can recognize Gashat levels on sight. And I also kind of like that the name of that level 4 Gashat. The wedge that's driven between him and Genmu is also so natural, as the Game Master persona makes Kuroto see bugsters as puppets for him to control, a clear conflict with Parrod's own ideals to play with his bugster friends, even if it means destroying them. So it makes perfect sense why Parrod goes on to betray Kuroto and kill him, but it's also just really interesting to have these different villain dynamics going on rather than just a bunch of generals on the same side. Paradox also highlights another one of my favorite part of X8's aesthetics, which is the energy items. It might be this really small thing to some, but I love stupid small gimmicks, and I am so in love with the idea that there's this secondary gimmick accessible by the characters that grants like a little power boost. What makes this even cooler is how it ties into the video game motif early in the season, where each henshin spawns in all these random props to hide the energy items. So like X8 breaks a block and out comes a little energy item that gives him a speed boost. It's literally just like a video game. Paradox gets rid of like the containers, but the energy items are still there as like props now. So it kind of makes Paradox this master of them, like our energy item Kamen Rider, and it just makes him a more terrifying opponent. It's another little thing that really adds to the video game world building of the show. The simple fact that you can see all these little devices in every fight, just like a video game that may or may not get used in battle. And true to Parrod's character, it makes everything so exciting. Another tangentially related bit of world building I love in X8 that gets brought to the forefront here is the Bugster faction itself, and it boils down to the concept of them being video game villains from the Gashats. It really helps make the Gashats feel like real world video games in the X8 universe because there is a real and tangible quality to that idea, but it also makes the one-off monsters feel like more than one-off monsters. Each of their unique personalities and designs isn't random, it comes from the show's central gimmick. Switching to the Calabos bugsters was a very welcome change to keep the show fresh early on, but it did leave a few games unattended in terms of their own bugster from that game, until the second arc fixed that. I think what's even cooler about getting to meet the villains of the level 3 Gashats is that they share parts with their respective Calabos bugsters, and just adds another layer to the world building. It's a shame we never get Poppy wearing this Doremifa armor. It kind of would have been fun, especially since we do have bugsters that have monster forms. Graphite functioning as a pseudo rider with his own transformation call is so badass, and it would have been awesome to see Poppy do something similar, but I guess she becomes a full-on Kamen Rider, so that's better. On the topic of Poppy, what I do like about her is that even though she's a bugster, it's explained pretty easily why she's good, because Doremifa B is just a different genre of game, and she doesn't function as a bad guy, just as like the boss, which is essentially what the bugsters are. Applying the same logic to Burgermon, oh yeah, Burgermon's a good boy. The simple twist that they are computer viruses that have evolved to become normal human viruses is such a fun connection between the two contrasting themes, but it's also a really great way to explain their evolution throughout the show. Going from weird CG monstrosities to the new bugster suits manifesting instantly is really satisfying, but it comes from the explanation that they're viruses. They're evolving to the treatments people come up with for them. It's also a great reason for why the rider aesthetics start to change as the show goes on, but I'll talk about that later. Because while the bugsters and Kuroto are fantastic in this arc, the real linchpin of it all is the main rider trio. For Taiga, I think making Nico his sidekick was a smart decision because it starts this journey of him working closer with all the characters. He's got to watch out for this surrogate daughter he's taken under his wing now, so he becomes more empathetic, and I think this is most prominently shown when he scolds Nico for treating the surgeries like games, and when he takes the Gasha Gear Duel beta. Nico's alright on her own for for now. Sometimes she's funny, and I enjoyed how her backstory wasn't revealed immediately, but I think she's at her best as this companion for Taiga. Also, since Taiga is similar to the genius gamer M, Nico complements him perfectly since she's the genius gamer N. Taiga's interactions with Hiro were also really fun because of the Gashat Gear Duel beta. Since it's made from their stolen Gashats, it makes perfect sense why it becomes their power-up device despite being used by the villain. Taiga even says that because Bang Bang shooting was used to make simulations, it's his Gashat Gear Duel beta too. When they each power up for the first time, it's their first time transforming in a few episodes, so it's this super satisfying moment, and as a reward they get to retrieve their stolen Gashats, so the Gear Duel can keep kind of getting tossed between them, but we don't lose a rider in battle. It's a really fun dynamic for two side characters to have, and it played really well into their development, especially with Hiro. I love how goddamn wholesome Hiro gets in this arc as he starts to respect Emu as a member of CR. It was amazing seeing him try to bring back the intern he's so used to after he's been possessed by M, before Hiro just takes on Emu's duty to make a patient smile, in addition to taking on the genius gamer's skills in battle to transform again. My favorite moment though is definitely when Brave tells Emu that because he's the source of every Gashat, the creator of Mighty Brothers, and the person Kiryu entrusted his fate to, he has the power to change his own fate and power up the blank Gashat. All he needs to do is believe in himself, and we see that even Hiro believes in him when he calls him Emu instead of intern for the first time. To this new friendlier Hiro, I say thank you. That moment with Emu is one of my favorites in this arc with him specifically. Mighty Brothers Double X is also one of my favorite forms purely for the plot implications because we've set up Emu having two personalities, and then this form takes that idea and brings it to the forefront for the rest of the arc to play off of. The mystery of M being Emu's bugster is really fun because M is just right there half the time, especially when M possesses Emu the same episode the virus evolves to directly possess its host, so it seems pretty definitive that he's the bugster. The dilemma this causes when Emu is scared of transforming and being fully controlled by M was also excellently done because he's defying Taiga's advice, so it's almost like he's defying M as well. And this entire idea of creating a Gashat is completed in the finale, since Mighty Brothers was essentially a mistake, an unconscious reaction to Kiryu's death that unleashed the bugster virus. However, after coming to terms with M as a representation of the virus within him, Emu is able to harness that power again on his own terms using Kiryu's research. What really ties everything together is Hiro explicitly mentioning that Mighty Brothers was Emu's game idea that we saw before it even debuted. Emu crying on the rooftop is a beautiful ending to the first half of X8 in my opinion, showing that despite Kuroto's villainy, he's still a doctor that laments the loss of life. Oh wait, there's still episode 24. The episode functions mostly as setup, but I did like the Q Ranger cameo, and also the implication that Kuroto has worked alongside Graphite and Poppy for over 5 years, but he somehow forgot they were bugsters that came from the two last games he needed to complete Rider Chronicle. Crying Emu? Oh, that sounded bad. Max Dimension!